such an honor, and we feel very grateful. Tonight we have Lisa C. join us. Here is Lisa C. For the year of the sheep is very special. And Lisa C was born in the year of the sheep. So that's her year. And people born in this year, very creative, calm, and gentle, frank, and honest. I'm sure Lisa has all these characters. And today she's going to do some presentation, and we also have Mary Tom to be here tonight to share the story. And now I'm going to pass this to Lisa C.
So I thought I would start with just talking a little bit about my family and about why I write about the Chinese-American experience. I am part Chinese. My great-great-grandfather came to this country to work on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. I like to think of this man as one of the original deadbeat dads. You were supposed to come here, work hard, save up your money, and send it back home to China. Not my great-great-grandfather. He had a fondness for women and gambling, something that continues in our family even today. And as a result, my great-great-grandmother was so poor that she carried people on her back from village to village to earn money to support her children. Finally, some people took pity on her and lent my great-grandfather, who was only 14 years old, the money to come to the United States, what the Chinese called, as you all know, the Gold Mountain. Now, by this time the railroad was completed. He found his father working in Sacramento. He said, Dad, you're a bum, go home. And my great-grandfather did. And then my great-grandfather, who is still here, he did a lot of the jobs that immigrants do even today. He worked in the fields. He washed dishes in restaurants. He swept up in factories. But by the 1880s, in Sacramento, when he was around 30 years old, he had his first business. It was a factory that manufactured crotchless underwear for brothels. We all have to have our beginning in America. That's ours. Now, one day into his shop walked a young woman who I think of as being quintessentially American. Her family had come out west on the Oregon Trail in a covered wagon. They homesteaded in Oregon. We know so much more about that American pioneer life and how hard it was, particularly on women. Kaise's mother died when she was a baby. Her father died when she was just 7, and so she was raised by brothers who were reputed to be quite cruel to her. When she was 18 years old, she ran away from home. She couldn't afford San Francisco, ended up in Sacramento. And it wasn't like it is today, where if you're a young woman on your own and worst comes to worst, you could go work at Starbucks or 7-Eleven or Walmart or something like that. No one would hire her. I know she had one option for a job, but as far as I know, she didn't take it. And she ended up in Chinatown begging my great-grandfather for a job, and he did hire her to sell what we called in our family fancy underwear for fancy ladies. And one thing led to another. They fell in love. They decided to get married. But I use that term very loosely because here in the West, in 28 states, it was against the law for Chinese and Caucasians to marry. It was against the law in California till 1948, against the law in Washington State till 1967. I don't know what it was here. So this was all the way down to a quarter Chinese. In California, it was also against the law for Chinese down to a quarter to own property in the state. And at the federal level, it was against the law for Chinese to become naturalized citizens until 1943 with the overturn of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So for these two people to get married, what they did was they went to a lawyer who drew up a contract between two people as though they were forming a partnership. My grandparents went to Mexico to get married, and my own parents were only the second couple in our whole extended family to be married legally in the United States. I came out here to interview Mary, and I'm just going to ask you a few questions now. So, tell me about your childhood and how you grew up and where you grew up.
Okay. I was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1919. my brother had a grocery store, and when I graduated from high school, I could not get a job because there was prejudice. And so I was working for him in the grocery store, which I despised. And but later on, I got a job. Luckily, I went to San Francisco. No, I was determined to go to San Francisco after hearing stories about how wonderful San Francisco was from a lady friend. And she invited me to go and stay with her in a one-night free house hotel. So I did. I went that first night, and luckily, she asked me, did I know anyone in San Francisco? I had no one. I knew no one, and had no relatives, no friends there or anything, but I wasn't a bit afraid. So she offered out. I remember that I had met a lady just a few months ago from San Francisco, and she told me about how San Francisco was, and she gave me her address. So I gave her the lady's address, and it was right around the corner on Powell's on Mason Street. And so I went and called on her, and she offered me a room right then, a room for $1 a night. Her son had just moved away, and she offered me the room, so I took it for $1. I didn't know where I would get $1 because I only had $50. I bought a $25 ticket, bus ticket, and then $25 cash. And so, but I took the job. I took the offer and stayed with her for $1 a night. And then, as it turned out, I started working for a restaurant that had just opened up, and it paid $1 a night. And so that worked out fine. So I had a job at the restaurant, and where I got a meal for free, one meal a day. And then I had a room for $1 a night, and it worked out fine, and I was happy. I was very happy. I bought a little cheap piece of luggage to put clothes in. I had to buy clothes. I had to buy different things to travel because I had nothing, and I had no friends, no relatives, but I was happy. And I had a job, and they gave me a meal a day and a room for $1 a day.
Okay, now I'm going to ask another question. So how is it that you got your job at the Forbidden City? Mary was one of the original 8 chorus girls. Original 5. See, she's correcting me. One of the original 5. So tell me about tell everyone about how you got that job.
Okay, I was working in this restaurant. Got my meal. I had the room for $1 a night, and so that
somebody told you about that. Did someone tell you?
let's see. Oh wait, no. They told me about the job, yes. And we had none of us had ever danced before. The 5 girls that were chosen, we had never danced. We had never had lessons, but we went anyway, tried, and as long as you could count 1, 2, 3, 4, and back 1, 2, 3, 4, you were in. So we had a good time learning. It took us a whole year to learn the first dance, and we spent our days working. Luckily, we had a job. Like I had a job as a restaurateur, or I got a meal a day, and I had the hotel, the room for this lady. So I was all set. I was happy. It didn't matter where we were going to eat the next meal or what we were going to eat. We just were happy. 5 young girls who had no parents to forbid them to do things because the Chinese girls in San Francisco were not allowed to dance in a nightclub to show their legs.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that for a second. Don't go anywhere. One of the things about Mary's story is how absolutely true it is to the whole experience of performers, whether they were men or women. Many of them, almost all of them, grew up outside of a Chinatown in a big city. They weren't from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, because those Chinatowns, the culture was very traditional. A young woman wasn't allowed to be out on the street. She certainly wasn't allowed to show her bare arms or legs in public. And so as Mary said, you know, here are these first five chorus girls. You had lost your father by then, but your mother was still living, but really separated from family and very much separated from a lot of traditional customs and what traditional Chinese culture, we could say.
I was living in Phoenix, and I had moved to San Francisco under no objection from her. She allowed me to go. She said, if you want to do it, go ahead. So I did.
And how many brothers and sisters did you have?
I have 4.
Yeah, but
Then I had 4.
And your mother had bound feet, isn't that correct?
My mother came from the old country where they bound the baby's feet underneath their feet like that. And that's how they had to walk all their lives on their knuckles. So that's how my mother lived. But she didn't. She came to a new country with no knowledge of the language, no knowledge of the work, of course she worked, and no knowledge of anything. But she had 5 children, one after the other. She had 5 children. And so there we were, and we grew up in a little storeroom, which was no bigger than a playroom, but we lived there and grew up there, went to school. Oh, and then in the meantime, my brothers went back to China to get a Chinese education at ages 8 and 9, and so left the 2 girls behind with the mother, and that's how we lived. And we survived under very, very meager circumstances, but we did it.
Can you talk about just once the Forbidden City nightclub opened? Then once the club was open, what was a day like? I mean, when would you come into the club, and what did you wear? And
the nightclubs then were all American, big nightclubs, no small things. But we started out, we didn't have much to wear. They had meager costumes, which we wore, and we weren't allowed to show our legs at first, so we had long pants with the tops. Later on, we went to the shorter costumes, which was okay. By then, people accepted us, and we didn't have many costumes to wear and many dances to do. But we learned. They had a teacher. They taught us, and we learned from counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and we did it. So after about a year, we practiced during the day and worked at night. Worked in the nightclub, in the restaurant at night. And we had our meal, and.
But when the club was open, so once the club was open, you would go to work, and then you would go to the club, and you'd get dressed, and then tell us just a little bit, and then I'm going to go back to my talk. a little bit about what would happen between the shows and how the young women who were performers and in the chorus would go out and talk and sit with the customers.
Well, we were required to go and sit with them and talk to them, but we didn't really drink a lot. They gave us watered down drinks.
Because you had 3 shows a night.
Which was all right. And after a while, we got used to it, and it wasn't so bad. And they did not force us to go and mingle with the customers or to do anything wrong. We just danced with them, and we learned how to do the things that they do, serving them. And it was very, very good, very nice and clean, and there was nothing dirty about it.
And am I right that you met your husband? Didn't he come into the club? Am I correct about that?
Oh, that was a funny thing. My husband's friend was from Tucson, and my husband was from Tucson. I was from Phoenix, so this friend of my husband's came out to Tucson, to San Francisco, to court this girl that he liked, and it was a friend of my husband's. But she had to have a babysitter, so she couldn't go by herself, and so my husband was his babysitter, and I went along as my girlfriend's babysitter. So the 2 of us were just babysitters, and we went along with them wherever they went, and we had a good time for a whole month. And it was a lot of fun, and we did nothing wrong. We just all enjoyed each other. But after a year, they broke up and did not get married, but my husband and I continued our friendship, and we got married in 2 years. So we got married, and then I had 2 babies, one after another, and while I was pregnant, I still continued to work, but it was great fun. But after the second baby, I didn't know what I was going to do. The war was over. The soldier boys scattered, went home, and there wasn't much else to do. So we decided to come back to Tucson, where it was a healthier climate for the children. I decided to stay with the children rather than go on the road. So I did that, and so I stayed. Had 3 more children, so I had 5 altogether, and that's how it came about.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, so she amazing. So there's some other aspects to this book. So just imagine you've got these 3 girls, you've got the nightclub, things are going along pretty well, and then Pearl Harbor comes along, and overnight things change across our country. To all of our people, it changes how we look at the outside world, it changes how we look at each other, it changes what we eat, how we dress, and it changes for women. Everything changes. And if you consider the West, and let's just focus on San Francisco, it's like a microcosm, and things are changing there dramatically. Overnight, on the hills surrounding the bay, there are now radar towers looking for Japanese planes. You have, at night, giant tugboats that pull these heavy-duty nets from the San Francisco side to the Sausalito side, so that Japanese submarines won't sneak into the bay. You have, I'll just say this. They also had during the day planes that would go out and look for Japanese submarines. They never found any, but they did sink several whales in real life. This was a place where there was a lot of building going on for the war effort. Ships, ambulances, jeeps, tanks. At one point during the war, San Francisco was producing a ship a day, and many of the people who worked in those shipyards were women. It's where Rosie the Riveter was invented. San Francisco was also a liberty port, so all the men who were shipping out to the Pacific, all the men who were coming back from the Pacific were passing through San Francisco. And what do young men who may not have another tomorrow want? My tribe. Wine, women, and song. Yeah, definitely. So these clubs that had been going along pretty nicely, all of a sudden the business just really takes off. And they've got these pack shows 3 times a night and lines around the block, and they're just pack. So the thing is, even though some things are going really well, and it's a very transformative time, and certainly it's transformative for Chinese Americans, and I'm going to get to that. It's also transformative for Japanese Americans. This is a time of incredible issues of race and racism. And so for the Chinese, this is again, this transformative moment. Now China and the US were allies. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 could no longer stand. This was the one federal law from which all the other laws trickle down. And so finally it's overturned. And now it doesn't happen overnight. It takes all the way till 1967 for all of the rest of those laws to be wiped off the books. But this is the one change that now paves the way for people to become naturalized citizens, for people to become truly Chinese American, unless you'd already been born here. This was hugely transformative. Now, all of the negativity that had been out there for decades about the Chinese now shifted to the Japanese. And I found these articles in Time and Life magazines 2 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which were almost identical. They both showed a drawing of a man with arrows pointing at different parts of his body. And in Life magazine, what they wrote, and I'm going to read this, that they were encouraging their readers to overcome their distressing ignorance on the delicate question of how to tell the difference between a Chinese and a Japanese. And so these arrows pointed out the differences. Chinese can grow to 5'5", but a Japanese can't hit 5'2". You can recognize a Chinese man can't grow hair on his chest, but you can always recognize a Japanese because he can grow a mustache. Chinese has parchment-colored skin, which sounds kind of nice, but you can recognize a Japanese by their dirty, earthy, yellow-looking skin. And the Chinese, who for decades had been labeled inscrutable, now you could recognize them, and again I'm going to quote this, by their placid, kindly, and open expressions, while a Japanese can be counted on to laugh loudly at exactly the wrong time. Now, it's hard to imagine that you could have this kind of language in a mainstream magazine or newspaper or on a news broadcast, but this comes at a moment of incredible fear, incredible anger, and incredible paranoia, and all of that leads eventually to Japanese internment. Now, I had grown up my whole life hearing about internment. My grandfather was in a group of 3 friends. One of them still is, Tyrus Wong. He's probably the oldest Chinese American artist. He's 104 today. He didn't turn 104 today, but he turned 104 in November. And you may not know his name, but you've seen his work. He was the artist who created Bambi for Disney. So, and then his other friend was also an artist, Japanese American, named Benji Okubo. And so Benji was sent to Heart Mountain. I also know of other stories. There was a man named Goro Suzuki, who was a very well-known stand-up comedian in the Bay Area in the years leading up to the war, and all of those nightclubs in Chinatown. And he was sent to Topaz. And he started writing to people and saying, will you sponsor me to come out? And there were some people in the Midwest who sponsored him to come out and take his comedy act on the road through the Midwest. But when he left the camp, he changed his name from Goro Suzuki to Jack Sue. And Jack Sue became the first Asian American to have a regular role on television on Barney Miller. I interviewed a woman named Trudy Long, and Trudy was 17 when she was sent to Minidoka up in Idaho. And here was a young woman, 17 years old. She loved gossip. She loved movies. She loved nightclubs. Of course, she'd never been to a nightclub, but she loved the idea of them. And she loved to read all the nightlife articles, and all the nightlife people, and people like Walter Winchell, for example. And so one night, out of nowhere, she decided, I'm going to just start writing to them and see if one of them will sponsor me to come out. And one of them did. It was Lee Mortimer. He worked for the New York Daily News. He was a nightlife editor there. And he did sponsor her to come to New York, where he got her a job at the China Doll nightclub. And then there's Dorothy Choi. And Dorothy was 93 when I interviewed her. She's 97 today, and I know that Mary knew Dorothy. And Dorothy, she was actually Japanese. And what she said to me was she had looked at her, that she told me of the story of another actress who said she looked at her name up on the marquee and thought it looked too long. Her name was Ethel Zimmerman, and she changed her name and shortened it to Ethel Merman. And so she thought, well, if Ethel Merman can do it, so can I. So she had changed her name, shortened it to Dorothy Choi. Now, Dorothy and her partner, as the Chinese Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, they traveled all around the world. They played in Berlin and Paris and London. They were hugely famous. And she had this identity for about 10 years before Pearl Harbor. So when Pearl Harbor came along, she just kept on with this identity. No one questioned it. She and her partner, who had some roles in different films, finally get their big break. And they go down to Hollywood, and when they're in Hollywood, the FBI comes and knocks at her door and says, your best friend just ratted you out. She wants your part in the film. And that woman did get that part. And we're going to give you a choice, because we understand that you're famous. We get it that you're famous, so we're going to give you this choice. Either you need to leave the state, or you can go and stay with your family in the internment camp. And so she chose to leave the state, and she and her sister, who was a singer, traveled through the South, where going nightclub to nightclub, doing this kind of song and dance act, and where Dorothy told me they'd never seen a Chinese, they'd never seen a Japanese, they couldn't tell the difference, we knew we'd be safe. So this is my 9th book. I like to think I've grown as a writer. I hope I've grown as a writer. In my writing, I've been thinking about 3 ideas. 2 of them come from the 17th century women writers who were in the Yangtze Delta. More women writers just in the Yangtze Delta who were being published than altogether in the rest of the world at that time. Really remarkable women. And they had these 2 ideas. One was this idea that art is the heartbeat of the artist. And these words that I write and these books that I write, they are my heartbeat. The other is that you have to cut to the bone to write. And again, I don't know how many of you have read my books, but if you have, you know there's some really sad things that happen in them, and this book is no exception. And it's very hard for me to do that. I don't wake up in the morning and think, oh, goody, beautiful moon gets to die today. I mean, I just don't. It's very hard for me. And sometimes it's a scene that lasts a day, and sometimes it's pretty much a whole book, like Dreams of Joy, which is just really very sad, and it takes place during the Great Leap Forward in China, and 45 million people starved to death during that. So it was very hard for me to stay in that day after day after day. But what is it that writers are doing, and what is it that artists are trying to do? We're trying, and I know this sounds kind of highfalutin, but we're trying to get to the heart of human experience, the heart of human emotions, the heart of what it means to be a human being here on this earth. And that's not an easy place to go when you have to cut to the bone. And then the last is a couple of lines from Wallace Stegner's Angle of Repose. And I use these lines as the epigraph for On Gold Mountain, which was my first book, the book about my family. When I used these lines, I didn't know that they were going to be the words that would carry me through to today, will carry me through to every single book that I write till I die. And here's what he wrote. Fooling around in the papers my grandparents, especially my grandmother, left behind, I get glimpses of lives close to mine, related to mine in ways I recognize but don't completely understand. I'd like to live in their clothes a while. And that's what I've been trying to do, is just live in their clothes a while. Thank you so much.
Lisa has time to take a couple of questions if anybody has them.
Or for Mary, too. I can take this back over to her if you have questions. Otherwise, we can go back out and eat some egg rolls. Mary, do you have any sisters or family here in Tucson still today?
Yes, I have my daughter here, my granddaughter, and who else? Oh, my son here.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes. So what drew me to writing, I guess, right? Why did I write? I have to tell you, I was not one of these people who throughout my childhood wanted to be a writer, and I'm going to tell you why. My mother is a writer, my mother's father was a writer. I'm just going to tell you this story for a minute. So there were certain things I knew about myself. I knew I never wanted to be a writer, I never wanted to get married, I didn't want to have children, but I wanted to be a writer. Oh, and I didn't want to be a writer, but I wanted to spend my life living out of a suitcase, traveling around it. Part of the reason for this is because I had watched my mother writing and crying all the time because, you know, there's like a lot of emotion that comes out. And then my mother's father was a writer. Now, he was an interesting man. He also was like the ladies, let's just say, and he had 5 wives. Not all at once, but, you know, one after the other. And when he was 69, he and his wife, who was 2 weeks older than my mother, they had a baby. And we went down, and I must have been like 13 years old at the time, and we went down to visit them. And he was depressed, as you might imagine, because if you're 69 and you have a newborn baby in the house, I mean, I'd be depressed. So my mom, even though she was a writer, she was a single mother, she was a PhD in English, there wasn't a lot of work back then, and so one way that she used to support us, and this is back in the 1960s, was as an expert witness in pornography trials. And so, you know, she was Dr. C, and so they'd come up and say, oh, Dr. C, this language here is so offensive. And she'd say, oh, yes, well, this really derives from Shakespeare and, you know, the 4th scene and Othello or something like that. So she was the expert witness. And she had brought this whole stack of books. And I remember this so clearly. We were sitting at the kitchen table. My grandfather was so bummed. The stack of books was there. And finally, he just took one of them, started leafing through, took one of them, tootled off down to the back bedroom, came out a few hours later really much more cheerful. And not for the usual reasons, but he said, you know, I could write something better than this. And in fact, 2 weeks later, he had written his first hardcore pornographic novel. Now, here is a man who had always in his life wanted to write the great American novel, but like many people, he never got around to it. But now it seemed he'd found his calling. They always say about writers, write what you know. And he seemed to know a lot, because between that time and when he died, he wrote and published something like 76 hardcore pornographic novels. So I didn't really want to be a writer, okay? And I had this idea in my head. So when I was in college, I took 2 years off, and I was traveling around in Europe, and this dates me more than anything. It was back, and for those of you who can count the Chinese zodiac, you know how old I'm going to be next week. Because I'm a sheep year, and it's so sad. But we were traveling around, and this is back when you could do it on $5 a day or less. And there came a point when I was in Greece and just living there, and I had this idea, you know. I I don't want to get married, I don't want to be a writer, I don't want to have kids, I always want to live out of a suitcase. How on earth am I going to do that? How am I going to support myself? I had just been thinking about this for, a couple of years at that point. And one morning I woke up and it was like this light bulb went off. Oh, I could be a writer. And when I came home, in the first 48 hours, I got my first 2 magazine assignments. Now, clearly I didn't know myself very well because I did get married to a wonderful person. We have 2 children. We now have a grandchild. I became a writer. I still spend a lot of time living out of a suitcase, but the bloom is a little bit off that rose by now. And so I think once I decided to write, and once I started with On Gold Mountain in particular, the book about my family, I took this kind of, I can't say it's a different approach because I know other people do it, but it was new to me. So this idea, if you think about history and how we learn it, we tend to learn it in terms of wars and dates. We tend to learn it in terms of the front line, the generals, the presidents, the prime ministers, the soldiers. But if you take one step off that back line, who's there? It's women, it's children, it's the elderly, it's families trying to get by day to day. And that was the part that I was interested in. And when I was working on Gold Mountain, I could see that there were these things outside of their control. Local laws, wars, certainly the Chinese Exclusion Act, that had this very direct impact on them and the ways that they had chosen to live or had been forced to live, whether they understood it at the time or not. And that's the thing. History is happening to all of us all the time, right? I mean, it happened to our parents, it happened to our grandparents, it happened to our great-grandparents, but it's happening to all of us, even as we sit here tonight. We may not have a lot of perspective on it, but we are often at the mercy of it. And so I thought, well, if I could look at Chinese American and some parts of Chinese culture and history through that, of how it affects individual people, how it affects families, that could be really important, that could be a way where you could connect person to person. Because if you think about all the thousands and thousands of books that have been written about the Holocaust. What's the one book we all remember? The Diary of Anne Frank. One girl, one family. That you can take that whole huge history and that whole huge event, worldwide event that happens, and you can tell the whole thing through this one girl. And so that's what has really inspired me to write and also to keep writing the kinds of books that I do.